The scent of rain-dampened earth and wild thyme drifts through the high mountain passes of the Zagros, where the air is thin and the silence of the peaks feels as old as the stone itself. Long before the world knew the name of empires, there was only the wind whistling through the limestone crags and the steady, rhythmic clatter of goat hooves on the rocky slopes. We begin our journey here, in a world of deep shadows and golden light, in the 6th century before the Common Era. To the east, the vast plateau of Iran stretches toward the rising sun, while to the west, the fertile plains of Mesopotamia lie cradled between great rivers. But nestled within the rugged folds of the mountains lies the ancient land of Anshan, a place of hidden valleys and cool springs where a small, proud people known as the Persians made their home. At this time, the world was a patchwork of rival kingdoms, and the Persians were but a minor thread in a much larger tapestry. They lived under the shadow of the Medes, a powerful and sophisticated people to the north who commanded the high roads and the trade routes. The kings of Anshan, the Teispid dynasty, were little more than vassals, noble, yes, but required to pay tribute and bow their heads to the great king of Media, Astyages. It was a time of uneasy peace, where the boundaries of power were as shifting as the mountain mists, and no one could have guessed that from this quiet provincial backwater a spark would be struck that would set the ancient world ablaze with light. The city of Anshan was not a place of towering marble monuments, but rather a city of brick and timber that blended into the landscape, a place where the king's palace was modest and the people lived close to the land. Here, the lineage of Teispis ruled with a quiet dignity, passing the crown from father to son, generation after generation. They were a people of the bow and the horse, valuing truth above all things and teaching their sons to ride, to shoot, and to speak the truth. It was into this atmosphere of rugged honesty and mountainous isolation that a child was born, a child named Cyrus, a name that would one day echo through the halls of history as the King of Kings. But history is often coloured by the vibrant hues of legend, and the story of Cyrus's arrival into this world is one of the most enduring myths of antiquity. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us of a dream that haunted the sleep of the Median king, Astyages. In this dream, a vine grew from the womb of his daughter, Mandane, a vine that spread its leafy branches until it cast a dark, cool shadow over the entirety of Asia. The king's seers, their voices hushed and trembling, interpreted this vision as a prophecy of doom. They warned Astyages that his grandson would one day rise up to overthrow him and seize the crown of the Medes for himself. Fear is a cold companion, and it took root in the heart of the great king. When Mandane gave birth to a son, Astyages did not see a grandchild to be cherished, but a rival to be extinguished. He summoned his most trusted general, a man named Harpagus, and gave him a terrible command: to take the infant into the wilderness and ensure he did not survive the night. It is said that Harpagus took the child, but as he looked upon the innocent face of the babe, his heart failed him. He could not bring himself to spill royal blood, and so he passed the child to a humble shepherd who lived on the fringes of the kingdom, where the mountains meet the sky. As we imagine that small child, wrapped in coarse wool and carried deep into the quiet forests, perhaps you are finding your own sense of stillness tonight. If you are settling in and finding comfort in these echoes of the past, you are in the right place. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new history narrations every single day to help you drift into a peaceful rest. If you enjoy these journeys, please consider subscribing so you can join us every evening, and a gentle like on the video helps others find their way to our quiet corner of the world. And so, the boy who was born to be a king began his life not in a palace of gold, but in the simple hut of a shepherd. For 10 years, Cyrus grew up among the flocks, his playground the steep ravines and the flower-strewn meadows of the high country. He learned the language of the birds and the patterns of the stars, and he felt the biting chill of the winter snows and the searing heat of the summer sun. There is a certain wisdom that comes from the soil, a patience that is learned by watching the seasons turn and the lambs grow. The legend tells us that even as a child, Cyrus possessed a natural, quiet authority that drew others to him. During a game with the other village boys, they chose him to be their king, and he performed the role with such innate justice and command that word of the shepherd king eventually reached the ears of the court. The truth of his royal blood could not stay hidden forever, just as the sun cannot be obscured by a passing cloud. When Astyages finally encountered the boy, he recognized the noble features of his own family in the lad's face. The secret was out, but by then, the prophecy had already begun to weave its own path. The king, perhaps feeling a flicker of guilt, or perhaps believing the prophecy had already been fulfilled by the boy's election in a children's game, allowed Cyrus to return to his true parents in Anshan. Cyrus returned to the Persians not as a stranger, but as a son who had been forged by the earth itself. He brought with him the hardiness of the mountain folk and the humility of one who had lived a life of labor. He was a prince who understood the struggles of the common man, and a leader who knew that true power is not found in the weight of a crown, but in the loyalty of those who follow you. As the years passed, he watched the geopolitical landscape shift around him. He saw the decadence of the Median court and the growing restlessness of the Persian tribes, who long desired to stand on their own. The world of the 6th century was a place of giants. The Lydians in the west with their mountains of gold, the Babylonians with their towering ziggurats and blue-tiled gates, and the Medes who held the center. But in the quiet valleys of Anshan, a new kind of power was brewing, one that was not built on fear or the whims of a tyrant, but on a vision of a world united under a single just hand. Cyrus began to unite the various Persian tribes, moving from village to village, speaking not as a distant master, but as one of their own. He reminded them of their strength, of their heritage, and of the destiny that lay just beyond the horizon of the Zagros peaks. The transition from a shepherd of sheep to a shepherd of men was a gradual one, marked by long nights of planning and quiet conversations by the fire. He was a man of immense patience, waiting for the perfect moment when the fruit was ripe enough to fall. The legend of his birth had given him a certain aura of destiny, but it was his character, his steady, measured approach to leadership, that truly set him apart. He was preparing to step onto the world stage, not merely to conquer, but to architect a new way of ruling that the world had never seen. In these early years, the foundations of the Persian Empire were laid in the simple virtues of the mountain life. The air in Anshan remained crisp and clear, and the people continued their ancient ways, unaware that the young man walking among them was about to redraw the maps of the known world. The mountains stood as silent witnesses to his growth, their peaks dusted with the first snows of a coming change. As the light fades from our own world tonight, we can almost hear the distant sound of a shepherd's flute carried on the wind, a reminder of the humble beginnings of the man who would become the great king, the king of the 4 corners of the world. The cradle of Anshan had nurtured him well, and the legend of his survival was but the first chapter in a story that would stretch across continents and through the millennia, beginning with a single step out of the shadows of the Zagros and into the light of history. The scent of crushed mountain herbs and the dry, ancient dust of the Iranian plateau seems to linger in the air as we imagine the political landscape of the 6th century before the Common Era. For generations, the Persians had lived as a vassal state, a collection of pastoral tribes paying tribute to the mighty Median Empire, which ruled from the high, fortified city of Ecbatana. To the Medes, the Persians were perhaps little more than a source of hardy soldiers and mountain wealth, but beneath the surface of this subservience, a quiet fire was beginning to burn. Cyrus, now the king of Anshan, understood that the relationship between his people and their Median overlords was one defined by an uneasy tension, a balance of power that had existed for over a century, but was now reaching its natural conclusion. The Medes were led by Astyages, a king whose reign was whispered to be marked by a growing cruelty and a disconnect from the very lords who supported his throne. It is in this atmosphere of internal friction that we find the catalyst for Cyrus's rise, a man named Harpagus. History tells us that Harpagus was a high-ranking Median general who harbored a deep and personal grievance against his king, and it was he who reached out into the shadows to find an ally in the young Persian leader. We can imagine the secret messengers traveling by night, crossing the rugged passes of the Zagros mountains with letters hidden inside the bellies of hunted hares, carrying word that the time for revolution had finally arrived. Cyrus did not act on impulse, but rather with the slow, deliberate care of a weaver at a loom, ensuring every thread of his plan was secure before he made his move. He began by mobilizing the Persian tribes, calling upon the Pasargadae, the Marafi, and the Maspiai to set aside their local concerns and look toward a shared future. In the cool evening air of the highlands, Cyrus reportedly gathered his people and gave them a choice, presenting them first with a day of grueling, back-breaking labor, clearing thorny brush, followed the next day by a magnificent feast of wine and roasted meats. When he asked them which life they preferred, the toil of the slave or the bounty of the free, the answer was a thunderous roar that echoed through the valleys. The Persian people were no longer merely a collection of shepherds. They were a unified force, bound by the vision of a man who promised them dignity and a place at the center of the world stage. As the year 553 before the Common Era dawned, the simmering resentment transitioned into open defiance. The war between the Persians and the Medes was not a swift affair, but a series of maneuvers and clashes that tested the resolve of both sides. For 3 long years, the mountains and plains witnessed the movement of vast armies, the glint of bronze shields in the midday sun, and the steady beat of horse hooves against the sun-baked earth. Astyages, realizing the gravity of the threat, eventually took to the field himself, leading the core of the Median army against his rebellious grandson. The climax of this struggle arrived at the Battle of Pasargadae, a location that would forever be etched into the memory of the Persian soul. The air would have been thick with the sound of snapping banners and the low, rhythmic chanting of soldiers preparing for the final confrontation. It is said that the initial stages of the battle were desperate for the Persians, with many retreating toward the safety of the city walls, where their families watched from the heights. But in a moment of profound courage and strategic brilliance, the tide began to turn. The Median forces, weary of their king's tyranny, and perhaps inspired by the unwavering spirit of the Persians, began to falter. In a turn of events that feels almost like a fable, a large portion of the Median army, led by Harpagus himself, defected to Cyrus's side during the heat of the conflict. This was not merely a military victory, it was a psychological collapse of the old order. The soldiers of Media saw in Cyrus a leader who offered something their own king did not, a sense of justice and a shared purpose. As the dust settled over the plains of Pasargadae, the once mighty Astyages found himself deserted by his generals and surrounded by those he had once commanded. The surrender of the Median king was not a scene of slaughter or vengeful execution, but rather a quiet transition of power that signaled the birth of something entirely new. And so, the capital city of Ecbatana opened its gates to the Persian conqueror. One might expect that such a victory would be followed by the traditional spoils of ancient war, the burning of palaces, the enslavement of the populace, and the public humiliation of the fallen monarch. But it is here that Cyrus began to distinguish himself as a ruler unlike any the world had ever seen. Instead of treating the Medes as a conquered and broken people, he chose a path of reconciliation and integration. He spared the life of Astyages, keeping him as a guest in his court rather than a prisoner in a dungeon, and he allowed the Median nobles to retain their positions and their dignity. Cyrus understood a fundamental truth that many conquerors ignore, that an empire built on fear will eventually crumble, but one built on mutual respect can endure for centuries. By blending the Median and Persian administrations, he created a dual monarchy of sorts, where the Medes felt they were partners in a new, larger enterprise, rather than subjects of a foreign power. The flowing robes of the Median court and the administrative expertise of their scribes became integral parts of the Persian identity. In the quiet halls of the palaces, Persian and Median voices rose together in the pursuit of governance, creating a tapestry of cultures that would become the hallmark of the Achaemenid Empire. As the years passed, this mercy became the cornerstone of Cyrus's reputation. He was not merely a king who took land, he was a king who won hearts. The news of his clemency spread like a gentle breeze across the Near East, reaching the ears of distant kings and weary subjects alike. They heard of a leader who respected the gods of the lands he entered, who protected the weak, and who sought to build a world where different peoples could live side by side under a single just law. The transition from the shadows of the Zagros to the throne of an empire was complete, but for Cyrus, this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. The world beyond the borders of Media was watching, and the great powers of the age, Lydia to the west, Babylon to the south, and the mysterious lands beyond the eastern horizon, began to realize that the balance of the world had shifted. The shepherd from Anshan had become a lion, but a lion who moved with a grace and a restraint that was entirely unexpected. As the stars began to appear over the newly won city of Ecbatana, reflecting in the cool waters of the palace gardens, the people of the plateau could finally sleep with a sense of security they had not known for generations. The rise against the Medes had not resulted in a new tyranny, but in the dawn of a golden age, a time when the architect of the Persian Empire began to lay the foundations for a civilization that would bridge the gap between the East and the West, forever changing the course of human history. The scent of pine resin and cold mountain air drifted down from the peaks of the Zagros, carrying with it the quiet realization that peace is often a fleeting guest in the halls of kings. Far to the west, beyond the rolling hills and the winding rivers of Anatolia, another power watched the rise of the Persians with a mixture of envy and growing trepidation. King Cyrus of Lydia, a man whose name had become synonymous with the glittering weight of gold, sat within his citadel at Sardis and pondered the shifting tides of the world. He was a man who believed in the tangible, in the clinking of coins and the strength of his legendary cavalry, yet even he felt the need to consult the unseen forces of fate before challenging the young conqueror from the east. Croesus sent his messengers across the sea to the craggy slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the oracle at Delphi sat amidst the rising mists of a sacred chasm. He sought a sign, a confirmation that his ambition was favored by the gods. When the word returned, it was wrapped in the characteristic fog of prophecy. The Pythia declared that if Croesus crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged by these words, seeing only the glory he craved, the Lydian king led his forces forward, never stopping to consider that the empire destined for destruction might very well be his own. It is a quiet irony of history, how the mind hears only what it desires, filtering out the warnings that whisper in the spaces between the words. The two armies met at Teria, beneath a sky that turned grey with the coming of winter. The battle was fierce but indecisive, and as the first frosts began to bite at the fingers of the soldiers, Croesus followed the traditional customs of ancient warfare. He withdrew his troops to the warmth of Sardis, intending to disband his levies for the season and wait for the spring thaws to resume the campaign. He assumed that Cyrus, far from his own supply lines and facing the brutal mountain cold, would do the same. But Cyrus was a leader who understood that the rhythm of nature could be bent to the will of a determined heart. Instead of retreating, he led his men on a grueling march through the snow and the biting winds, following the Lydians back toward their own capital. As the Persian army emerged from the mountain passes and onto the plains before Sardis, Croesus was forced to scramble, calling out his elite cavalry to meet this unexpected threat. The Lydian horsemen were famous throughout the known world, brave men on powerful steeds, armed with long spears that had broken many a shield wall. Cyrus, observing the field, realized that a direct charge would be devastating. It was here that he employed a tactic born of keen observation and a touch of the unconventional. He had noticed that horses possessed a natural, instinctive fear of the smell of camels, a scent that was pungent and unfamiliar to the Anatolian mounts. He ordered his baggage camels to be brought to the front, stripping them of their packs and mounting them with riders disguised as cavalry. As the Lydian horses caught the scent of these strange, humped creatures loping toward them through the winter mist, they panicked. The disciplined ranks of the Lydian cavalry dissolved into a chaos of rearing animals and shouting men, the horses bolting away from the perceived monsters. The Lydians were forced to dismount and fight on foot, but the momentum had shifted. They were driven back behind the high, thick walls of Sardis, and the long, cold siege began. The citadel of Sardis was perched upon a steep, rocky spur, seemingly impregnable to any direct assault. For 14 days, the Persians circled the base of the cliffs, looking for a weakness in the stone. It is said that the breakthrough came not from a grand strategy, but from a single, quiet observation. A Persian soldier watched as a Lydian defender accidentally dropped his helmet over the edge of the precipice. The defender, thinking himself unobserved, climbed down a hidden, narrow path among the rocks to retrieve his gear. This tiny lapse in caution revealed a secret way up the heights, a path that the Lydians had left unguarded, believing the terrain itself was their protector. And under the cover of a moonless night, a small band of Persian climbers scaled the cliffs, moved like shadows over the battlements, and opened the gates from within. The city that had glittered with the wealth of centuries fell in a single, tumultuous evening. Legend tells us that as the fires began to lick at the edges of the palace, Cyrus and Croesus finally met. In some accounts, the Lydian king was placed upon a great pyre, only to be saved by a sudden cooling rain sent by Apollo, a sign that even in defeat there was a dignity to be preserved. Cyrus, moved by the fallen king's reflections on the fickleness of fortune, chose not to execute his rival. Instead, he made Croesus an adviser, keeping the old king by his side, so that he might learn from the wisdom of a man who had lost everything. With the fall of Sardis, the vast treasury of Lydia flowed into the Persian coffers. This was a land where the sands of the Pactolus River ran with electrum, and where the first true coins had been minted. Cyrus now held the keys to a financial system that would allow him to maintain his growing empire without the constant need for plunder. But he inherited more than just gold. The conquest of Lydia brought the Persians into direct contact with the Ionian Greek cities along the coast, places of philosophy, maritime trade, and vibrant culture. Milesus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus were now part of a larger tapestry, their white marble temples and bustling harbours serving as the western gateway for the Persian world. Cyrus did not seek to crush the spirit of these Greek cities, though he insisted on their loyalty and the payment of tribute. He understood that an empire is not merely a collection of conquered territories, but a living network of diverse people who must find a reason to coexist. He appointed satraps to govern the region, ensuring that the local customs were respected so long as the peace was maintained. The integration of these lands meant that Persian officials began to walk the streets of Ionian towns, and Greek architects and scholars began to find their way to the heart of Persia, sharing ideas that would slowly begin to blend the aesthetics of the Mediterranean with the grandeur of the East. As the winter sun began to climb higher in the sky, signaling the arrival of a new spring, the map of the world had been irrevocably redrawn. The wealth of Croesus was no longer a hoard kept within a single city, but the lifeblood of a rising superpower. Cyrus stood amidst the ruins of the old order, not as a destroyer, but as a collector of civilizations. He looked toward the horizon where the great cities of Mesopotamia lay, ancient, storied, and unaware that the man who had tamed the Medes and captured the gold of Lydia was now turning his gaze toward the hanging gardens and the blue-tiled gates of Babylon. The soldiers sat around their campfires in the cool Anatolian evenings, telling stories of the camels that had won a battle and the secret path that had ended a kingdom. There was a sense of wonder in their voices, a feeling that they were part of something larger than themselves, guided by a leader who moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew that destiny was not a matter of chance, but a matter of patience and vision. The world was becoming smaller, the distances between cultures shrinking as the hoofbeats of the Persian messengers began to echo along the royal roads, weaving together a story of silk and stone, of gold and dust, all under the watchful, steady gaze of the architect of the empire. The scent of wild thyme and crushed juniper begins to rise from the earth as the Persian horses turn their heads toward the rising moon, leaving the familiar valleys of Media and the fertile plains of Elam far behind. To the east, the horizon does not end in a gentle slope, but rises in a jagged spine of purple and slate, where the world seems to stretch its limbs toward the stars. Cyrus does not see these mountains as barriers, but as the pillars of a house yet to be built, a house that will eventually span the breadth of the known world. As the Persian vanguard moves deeper into the rugged highlands, they enter the lands of Hyrcania and Parthia, regions where the air is thin and the winds carry the ancient songs of the nomads. These are territories of vast, silent forests and sun-drenched steppes, where the inhabitants have long lived by the rhythm of the seasons and the strength of their own hands. Cyrus approaches these distant fringes not with the heavy hand of a conqueror, but with the steady persistence of a gardener tending to a sprawling, wild estate. He understands that to secure the heart of his empire, he must first ensure that its furthest limbs are strong and loyal. The campaigns through Hyrcania and Parthia are less about the clash of bronze and more about the quiet work of diplomacy and the establishment of order, a slow rhythmic progression that brings the scattered tribes into the fold of a shared destiny. Moving further south into the arid beauty of Drangiana, the landscape shifts into a palette of ochre and burnt sienna, where the dust of the desert floor rises in soft plumes behind the marching columns. Here, the water is a precious secret, held in the deep veins of the earth, and the survival of the people depends on their mastery of the underground channels that keep the gardens green. Cyrus watches as his engineers study these ancient techniques, realizing that to govern these lands is to understand the language of the soil itself. By securing these borders, he is not merely drawing lines on a map. He is weaving a protective web around the core of his realm, ensuring that the peace of the center is mirrored by the stability of the edges. As the years pass and the empire grows, the gaze of the great king turns toward the far northeast, where the Jaxartes River flows like a ribbon of silver through the harsh, wind-swept plains of Central Asia. This is the edge of the world as the Persians know it, a place where the sedentary life of the city meets the restless energy of the great northern steppes. It is here that Cyrus decides to plant a seed of permanence in a landscape of constant motion. He orders the founding of a great city, a northern sentinel that will bear his own name, Cyropolis. Imagine the scene as the first stones are laid in the shadow of the mountains. The rhythmic sound of hammers against granite, the smell of fresh cedar being shaped into massive gates, and the sight of smoke rising from the hearths of a new community. Syropolis is more than just a fortress. It is a statement of intent. It serves as a strategic anchor against the fierce nomadic tribes of the north, a place where the light of Persian civilization can shine out across the dark expanse of the plains. The Jaxartes River becomes a natural boundary, a shimmering line that separates the settled world from the wild unknown, and Cyrus walks its banks with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has tamed the very landscape through which he moves. Beyond the walls of his new cities, the empire encounters the diverse and vibrant cultures of the Bactrians and the Sakas, peoples whose lives are defined by the vastness of the space they inhabit. The Bactrians are a proud and settled people, living in the fertile valleys of what we now call northern Afghanistan, where the mountains hold treasures of lapis lazuli and gold. The Sakas, on the other hand, are the masters of the horse and the bow, a nomadic confederation that moves with the grace of the wind across the boundless grasslands. Cyrus does not seek to erase the identities of these people, for he knows that a tapestry is only as beautiful as the variety of its threads. Instead, he begins the delicate process of assimilation, inviting their leaders to his court and incorporating their finest warriors into his own elite ranks. He listens to their stories, respects their gods, and honors their traditions, creating a sense of belonging that transcends the boundaries of language and blood. The fierce independence of the Sakas and the refined culture of the Bactrians are not crushed, but are instead gathered into the imperial fold, like tributaries flowing into a great, calm river. This is the genius of the architect. He builds a structure large enough to house 1,000 different spirits, each one finding its place within the grand design. The logistical mastery required to govern such vast and rugged territories is a feat that defies the imagination of the age. To move a message from the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean to the snowy passes of the Hindu Kush requires a system of coordination that functions with the precision of a heartbeat. Cyrus oversees the creation of a network of roads and way stations where fresh horses and weary travelers can find rest and sustenance. He understands that an empire is not held together by walls alone, but by the flow of information and the ease of movement. The Persian messengers, known for their speed and endurance, become the lifeblood of the realm, riding through heat and cold, through mountain mist and desert glare, to ensure that the will of the king is known in every corner of his domain. The sheer scale of the administration is a testament to the clarity of his vision. Thousands of scribes recording the harvest, governors managing the local affairs of 12 different provinces, and engineers maintaining the vital infrastructure that keeps the world turning. As the sun sets over the distant peaks of the Pamirs, casting long violet shadows across the plains, one can almost feel the weight of the silence that settles over the empire. It is a peaceful silence, born of the knowledge that the borders are secure and the people are watched over by a leader who values the quiet strength of order over the loud chaos of war. The vastness of the territory is no longer a burden, but a source of wonder, a testament to the reach of a single man's mind. We can picture Cyrus in these moments of quiet reflection, perhaps standing on the battlements of a remote outpost, looking out over the flickering campfires of 12 different tribes, all resting under the same stars. He sees the smoke of the Bactrian hearths mingling with the cold air of the north, and he knows that the empire is no longer just a collection of conquered lands. It has become a living, breathing entity, a mosaic of cultures and landscapes held together by the gravity of his presence. The rugged beauty of the Far East, with its unforgiving terrain and its resilient people, has been woven into the story of the Persians, adding a layer of depth and complexity to the growing tapestry. The architect has looked upon the wild edges of the world and seen not a threat, but a foundation. And so, the empire continues to breathe, steady and deep, as the hoofbeats of the messengers fade into the distance, leaving only the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass of the steppes and the gentle murmur of the Jaxartes river as it carries the secrets of the mountains down to the waiting sea. The heavy scent of incense and old stone lingers in the humid air of the Mesopotamian lowlands, where the city of Babylon sits like a crown upon the earth, its blue-tiled gates shimmering under the weight of centuries. But within those high, thick walls, a quiet tension has begun to fray the edges of the city's spirit. The king, Nabonidus, has turned his gaze away from the traditional heart of the city, neglecting the ancient rites of Marduk, the great patron god of Babylon, in favor of the moon god, Sin. For years, the king has lived in a distant desert oasis, leaving his son Belshazzar to govern a people who feel increasingly abandoned by their ruler and their gods. The priests whisper in the shadows of the ziggurats, their voices echoing through the cool, dim corridors of the temples as they wait for a sign that the order of the world might be restored. As the year 539 before the Common Era draws near, the shadow of the Persian eagle begins to stretch across the fertile plains. Cyrus does not approach Babylon as a mere conqueror seeking to burn and pillage. He moves with the patience of a master weaver, understanding that the strongest empires are not held together by chains, but by the quiet consent of the governed. He has watched from afar as the internal friction within Babylon grew, listening to the reports of discontented merchants and disillusioned priests. He knows that the city, for all its legendary strength and its walls that seem to touch the clouds, is vulnerable in ways that stone and bronze cannot protect. The Euphrates River, wide and dark, flows directly through the heart of Babylon, providing life and defense to the millions within. It is a constant, rhythmic pulse, a silver thread that the Babylonians believe makes their fortress impregnable. But Cyrus, ever the architect of the unexpected, looks at the river not as a barrier, but as a path. In the quiet hours of an autumn evening, while the city prepares for a great festival and the sound of music and revelry begins to drift over the ramparts, the Persian engineers begin their work. They labor in the soft mud upstream, digging deep trenches to divert the flow of the mighty river into a nearby basin. Slowly, the water level begins to drop. The gurgling currents recede, revealing the slick, silken mud of the riverbed. Under the cover of the deepening twilight, the Persian soldiers do not climb the walls or batter the gates. Instead, they wade through the knee-deep water, walking quietly where the river once surged. They enter the city beneath the massive iron grates that usually sit deep under water, stepping into the very heart of the capital without a single alarm being raised. It is a victory of intellect over brute force, a silent transition that feels almost like a dream. By the time the sun rises over the hanging gardens, the city has changed hands, yet the streets remain peaceful. There is no smoke rising from the houses, no cries of terror in the markets. The transition is so seamless that many citizens wake to find the world transformed, without having heard a single sword clash against a shield. When Cyrus finally enters the city through the Ishtar Gate, he does so not as a foreign oppressor, but as a liberator draped in the mantle of divine will. He understands the power of the story, the way a narrative can soothe the anxieties of a conquered people. He does not claim victory through the strength of his own arm alone. Instead, he proclaims that Marduk himself, the god of Babylon, had scanned all the lands of the earth, searching for a righteous ruler to restore the ancient order. He tells the people that Marduk took Cyrus by the hand, calling him by name, and led him into the city to end the neglect of the old king. In this way, he transforms himself from an outsider into the chosen instrument of the Babylonian faith. To solidify this peace, Cyrus commissions a clay cylinder covered in the intricate, bird-like wedges of cuneiform script to be buried in the foundations of the city walls. This cylinder, which would one day be unearthed by archaeologists thousands of years later, serves as a grand declaration of his policy. In a calm and measured tone, the text describes how he allowed the people to return to their homes and how he restored the ruined temples that had been neglected for so long. He speaks of returning the sacred statues to their rightful sanctuaries, ensuring that the local religious cults could flourish once more under his protection. It is a document of profound tolerance, a realization that an empire is most stable when its subjects feel their traditions are respected and their gods are honored. The Cyrus cylinder becomes a testament to a new way of ruling, one that values the restoration of order over the chaos of destruction. As the scribes press their styluses into the wet clay, recording the king's promises of peace and the safe return of displaced peoples, a sense of relief washes over the region. The captives who had been brought to Babylon in generations past, including the Jewish people who had long wept by the rivers of Babylon, find themselves granted the freedom to return to their ancestral lands. Cyrus provides the resources and the protection for them to rebuild their own temples, weaving a thread of gratitude into the very fabric of his expanding realm. Meanwhile, the city of Babylon continues to breathe, its markets bustling with the same energy as before, but with a newfound sense of security. The Persian administration settles in, not to erase the Babylonian identity, but to preserve it. The great libraries remain open, the astronomers continue to track the movements of the stars from their high towers, and the merchants continue to trade their spices and silks along the banks of the diverted river. Cyrus sits in the palace of the kings who came before him, listening to the petitions of the locals and ensuring that the laws are applied with a steady, even hand. The architect has added the greatest jewel to his crown, yet he remains humble in his public image, often referring to himself simply as the king of the world, the great king, the powerful king. This title is not born of arrogance, but of a recognition of the immense responsibility he has undertaken. He has united the disparate threads of the East and the West, creating a space where different languages and different gods can exist under a single vast sky. The air in Babylon grows cooler as autumn fades into winter, and the stars shine with a crisp, clear light over the desert sands. As the years pass, the legend of the fall of Babylon grows, not as a tale of blood, but as a story of a river that stepped aside to let a king pass. It is a reminder that the most enduring changes often happen quietly, like the shifting of the tide or the cooling of the earth at dusk. The empire is no longer just a collection of conquered territories. It is a living organism, pulsing with the diverse rhythms of a dozen different cultures, all held together by the vision of a man who saw the value in every tradition he encountered. And so the great city rests. The blue tiles of the Ishtar Gate reflect the soft glow of the moon, and the sentries on the walls look out over a landscape that is finally at peace. The Euphrates flows once more in its natural bed, its waters whispering against the stone quays, carrying the stories of the city down toward the sea. The architect of this new world watches the embers of his hearth fire, knowing that the foundation he has laid in Babylon is strong enough to support the weight of the future, as the empire continues to expand steady and deep into the unknown reaches of the horizon. The scent of cedarwood and old parchment fills the quiet halls of the royal archives, where the flickering light of oil lamps reflects off the smooth surface of clay cylinders. In this stillness, a single decree is etched into history, not with the sharp edge of a conqueror's sword, but with the steady hand of a statesman who understood that the strongest bonds are those forged in the spirit of return. This was the Edict of Restoration, a proclamation that would ripple through the centuries as a testament to a different kind of power. For the Jewish people, who had spent 70 years in the shadow of the Babylonian captivity, the words of Cyrus were more than a political gesture. They were the sound of a heavy gate finally swinging open toward the west. The journey back to Jerusalem was not merely a physical passage across the dusty plains and through the rugged mountains of the Levant. It was a reclamation of identity. Cyrus did not simply grant these exiles their freedom and leave them to the mercy of the elements. Instead, he opened the royal treasuries, ensuring that the gold and silver vessels which had been carried away by Nebuchadnezzar were returned to their rightful hands. He provided the logistical support, the timber from the distant forests of Lebanon, and the financial backing necessary to begin the monumental task of rebuilding the Second Temple. In the cool air of the morning, as the first caravans began to move toward the horizon, there was a sense that the world was being put right again, piece by piece, stone by layered stone. In the ancient scrolls of the Hebrew Bible, this Persian king is granted a title that remains unique among all foreign rulers. He is called the Messiah, the Anointed One. It is a striking reflection of his impact on the collective memory of a people, described as an instrument of a higher purpose who subdued nations not to erase them, but to restore them. To the exiles returning to the hills of Judea, Cyrus was a shepherd of the displaced, a figure whose authority felt less like a weight and more like a protective canopy. This was the birth of a new imperial philosophy, one where the king did not demand that his subjects abandon their gods or their languages, but rather invited them to flourish within the broad, sheltering shade of his dominion. As the years passed, and the smoke of the first sacrifices rose once again from the altars of Jerusalem, the Persian Empire began to take shape as a vast tapestry of cultural pluralism. Cyrus understood a fundamental truth that many before him had ignored, that a kingdom is more stable when its people feel seen and respected in their own traditions. This was the foundation of the satrapy system, a sophisticated method of governance that divided the immense territory into provinces, each overseen by a governor known as a satrap. These officials acted as the eyes and ears of the King of Kings, yet they allowed for a remarkable degree of local autonomy. In the bustling markets of Sardis, the quiet temples of Egypt, and the mountain fortresses of Media, the daily rhythms of life continued much as they always had, governed by local laws and ancient customs, yet unified by the overarching peace of the Achaemenid crown. Imagine the diversity of such a world, where a traveller could walk for months and encounter a dozen different tongues, 100 different deities, and 1,000 different ways of life, all while remaining under the protection of a single legal framework. The roads were becoming safer, the trade routes more reliable, and the exchange of ideas more fluid than ever before. This was not a peace maintained solely by the threat of violence, but by a shared interest in the stability of the whole. Cyrus moved through his empire like a gardener, tending to a vast and varied landscape, knowing which plants required the sun of direct attention and which thrived in the quiet shade of neglect. The administrative genius of this system lay in its balance. While the central government in Pasargadae or Babylon managed the grand strategies of defense and the collection of reasonable tributes, the heart of each culture was left to beat at its own pace. The satraps were often chosen from the local nobility, or were Persians who had immersed themselves in the ways of the land they governed. This created a layer of mediation that softened the impact of imperial rule, making the presence of the great king feel like a distant, benevolent presence, rather than an immediate, suffocating force. It was a delicate equilibrium, a dance of power and restraint that allowed the empire to breathe and expand without the brittleness that often leads to collapse. In the quiet evenings, As the stars begin to emerge over the limestone plateaus of Iran, one can almost hear the echoes of the many voices that found a home under this new order. There is the soft murmur of Aramaic, which became the lingua franca of the administration, bridging the gap between the Mediterranean and the Indus. There is the rhythmic chanting of priests in distant temples, and the steady clatter of merchant carts carrying spices, silks, and precious stones along the burgeoning royal road. Cyrus had created a space where the world could gather, a sanctuary for the displaced and a workshop for the ambitious. This policy of tolerance was not merely a tactic of convenience, it was a reflection of a deeply held belief in the inherent dignity of the human experience. By recognizing the right of the Jewish people to return to Zion, and by supporting the restoration of countless other local cults and traditions across his lands, Cyrus established a precedent for human rights that would echo through the millennia. The Cyrus cylinder, that small barrel of baked clay found in the ruins of Babylon, speaks of a ruler who sought to gather all the people and return them to their habitations. It is a message of healing after the trauma of war, a promise that the era of mass deportations and the systematic erasure of cultures had come to an end, replaced by a vision of a world where many nations could coexist under one sky. The landscape of the empire was changing, not just politically, but physically. New canals were being dug to bring water to thirsty fields, and the foundations of new cities were being laid with an eye toward beauty and permanence. The architecture of the era began to reflect this synthesis of styles, the fluted columns of the Greeks, the monumental gateways of the Assyrians, and the delicate floral motifs of the Persians, all blending into a singular, harmonious aesthetic. It was a visual representation of the empire itself, a structure built from many parts, each retaining its unique character while contributing to the strength and elegance of the whole. As the light of the moon washes over the silent ruins of the ancient world, we can see the legacy of this imperial tolerance in the very dust of the earth. The return to Zion was just one chapter in a much larger story of restoration and respect. It was a moment when a conqueror chose to be a liberator, and in doing so, he ensured that his name would be spoken with reverence by people who lived thousands of miles apart and worshipped in vastly different ways. The architect of the Persian Empire had realized that the most enduring monuments are not those built of stone, but those built in the hearts of a grateful people, who are given the freedom to remember who they are and the peace to imagine who they might become. The steady pulse of the empire continues, a rhythmic heartbeat that carries the promise of security into the furthest corners of the known world. From the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Oxus, the shadow of the wing of the great king offers a cool respite from the heat of ancient rivalries, and as the night deepens, the world rests in the knowledge that the foundations are deep, the laws are just, and the horizon is wide enough to hold the dreams of every soul who calls this vast expanse their home. Imagine, if you will, the scent of damp earth rising from a network of stone channels where the cool waters of the Pulvar River are guided with mathematical precision through the high plateau of the Fars region. This is the air of Pasargadae, the first capital of the Achaemenid Empire, a place where the concept of a garden was transformed into a profound statement of cosmic order. Here, Cyrus did not build a fortress of jagged stone or a city of cramped, winding streets, but rather a sanctuary of open spaces and flowing water. At the heart of this capital lies the Chahar Bagh, the fourfold garden, a design so influential that its echoes would be felt centuries later in the courtyards of the Alhambra and the marble terraces of the Taj Mahal. The garden is divided into 4 quadrants by limestone conduits, creating a cross of life-giving water that represents the 4 corners of the world brought into perfect, tranquil harmony under the king's stewardship. As we walk through these ancient grounds in our mind's eye, the sound of the wind through the cypress trees mingles with the gentle bubbling of the rills. The Persians did not see the garden merely as a luxury, but as a physical manifestation of paradise on earth, a word which itself finds its roots in the old Persian Pyri Daeza, meaning a walled enclosure. In this space, the wildness of nature is not conquered, but invited into a conversation with human reason. Fruit trees heavy with pomegranates and almonds cast long, soft shadows across the clover, and the air is thick with the fragrance of roses and jasmine. It is a place of profound stillness, where the weight of an empire is balanced by the lightness of a falling petal. The architecture of the palaces at Pasargadae reflects this same desire for openness and clarity. Unlike the heavy, intimidating structures of the Assyrians who came before, the audience halls of Cyrus, the Apadana, are characterized by their slender, soaring columns and vast, airy porticos. These buildings do not seek to shut the world out. Instead, they invite the garden inside. The stone used is a high-contrast palette of dark grey and creamy white limestone, polished until it gleams like the surface of a mountain lake. The minimalism of the design is intentional, a quiet confidence that does not need to shout to be heard. The great halls are surrounded by wide verandas, allowing the king to sit in the shade while looking out over the verdant expanse of his creation, a ruler who breathes the same air as the blossoms he has planted. If you look closely at the stone carvings that adorn the doorways and the bases of the pillars, you begin to see the true genius of the Achaemenid vision. It is a tapestry of the world's artistic heritage, woven together with a gentle hand. You might notice the delicate pleats of a robe carved in the Ionian Greek style, or the sturdy, muscular forms of bulls that evoke the ancient traditions of Mesopotamia. There are winged figures that whisper of Egyptian influence and intricate floral patterns that speak of the nomadic roots of the Iranian plateau. Cyrus did not seek to erase the cultures he had integrated into his empire. He invited their craftsmen to bring their best work to his capital. In the stone of Pasargadae, the world is not a collection of conquered territories, but a symphony of diverse voices, each contributing a unique note to the grander melody of the Persian state. The carvings tell stories of mythical beasts and protective spirits, yet they lack the scenes of violence and conquest so common in the art of other ancient empires. Instead, we see the king depicted in a posture of quiet dignity, often accompanied by attendants who carry his fly-whisk or his parasol. There is a sense of domesticity and peace, even in the grandest of settings. The columns themselves are topped with the heads of twin bulls or lions, looking out in opposite directions as if to keep a gentle watch over the four quarters of the earth. These stone sentinels have stood for over 2 millennia, weathered by the sun and the wind, yet they still retain an aura of watchful serenity, guarding the memory of a king who believed that strength was best expressed through the creation of beauty. As the path leads us further into the plain, away from the rhythmic splashing of the garden fountains, the landscape becomes more austere. And there, standing alone against the vast backdrop of the mountains, is the most iconic structure of Pasargadae, the tomb of Cyrus. It is a monument of startling simplicity, a sharp contrast to the towering pyramids of Egypt or the ornate ziggurats of Babylon. It consists of a high, 6-stepped plinth made of massive white limestone blocks, topped by a small gabled chamber that resembles a modest house with a pitched roof. There are no inscriptions boasting of bloody victories, no towering statues of a god-king. It is a structure that speaks of the mortality of man and the enduring nature of his deeds. The masonry is so precise that even today, after more than 2,000 years, the joints between the stones are nearly invisible, held together not by mortar, but by the sheer weight of the limestone and the skill of the masons. It is said that when Alexander the Great reached this spot 2 centuries later, he found the tomb surrounded by a grove of trees and guarded by a family of priests who had watched over it for generations. Inside, the chamber was simple: a golden couch, a table set with drinking vessels, and a golden coffin. But it was the epitaph, reportedly inscribed upon the wall, that moved the Macedonian conqueror to silence. It read, "O man, whoever you are, and wherever you come from, for I know you will come, I am Cyrus, who won the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my body." The tomb is a reflection of the man himself, firmly grounded, yet reaching toward the sky, powerful, yet remarkably humble. As the twilight settles over the plateau of Pasargadae, the white limestone of the tomb seems to hold the last of the day's light, glowing softly against the deepening blue of the Persian sky. The gardens, though now mostly reclaimed by the dust of time, still live on in the geometry of the landscape and the memory of the water that once flowed through them. The 4 gardens were more than just a place to walk. They were a blueprint for a way of living, a reminder that the role of a leader is to cultivate, to nurture, and to bring order to the wilderness. In the silence of the evening, one can almost hear the rustle of the silk robes of the courtiers as they moved between the pillars of the audience hall, their voices low and respectful. The empire was managed not just from the saddle of a horse, but from the quiet corners of these gardens, where the king could reflect on the heavy responsibilities of justice and mercy. The architecture of Pasargadae was the physical soul of the Achaemenid spirit, unpretentious, inclusive, and deeply connected to the natural world. It was a place where the earth and the heavens seemed to meet, held together by the vision of a man who saw himself not as a master of slaves, but as a gardener of souls. And so the stones of the palace and the tomb remain, weathered and worn, yet enduring. They stand as a testament to a moment in history when a vast portion of the world was united under a single, relatively gentle hand. The wind that brushes past the tomb of Cyrus carries with it the scent of the dry earth and the distant memory of the roses that once bloomed in the Chahar Bagh. It is a reminder that while empires may rise and fall, the beauty we create and the kindness we show are the only things that truly linger in the cooling air of the centuries. The great king sleeps now beneath his little earth, while the stars he once looked upon continue their slow, silent dance over the plains of Iran, watching over a legacy that is written not just in stone, but in the very idea of a world at peace. The scent of dry grass and the sharpening chill of the northern wind signal a change in the season, a quiet transition that mirrors the final movement of a life spent in constant motion. As the years of his reign stretched into their 3rd decade, Cyrus did not seek the soft cushions of a palace in Susa or the shaded balconies of Babylon, but instead turned his gaze toward the northeastern frontier, beyond the river Oxus, where the vast steppes of Central Asia meet the sky in an unbroken line of grey and gold. Here lived the Massagetai, a fierce and nomadic people who moved like the wind across the plains, led by a woman of iron will named Queen Tamiris. It is said that Cyrus, now an old man whose hair and beard had turned to the colour of winter frost, felt a lingering duty to secure the edges of his world, to ensure that the peace he had woven together would not be unravelled by the restless tribes of the north. The campaign against the Massagetai is shrouded in the mists of legend and the conflicting accounts of ancient historians, yet it carries a weight of profound solemnity. We can imagine the Persian campfires flickering in the vast darkness of the steppe, the horses stamping their hooves against the cold earth, and the King of Kings sitting alone in his tent, perhaps reflecting on the sheer scale of the journey that had brought him from a small kingdom in Fars to the very edge of the known world. There is a quiet humility in these final moments, a realization that even the greatest of men is but a traveller, passing through a landscape that was here long before him, and will remain long after he is gone. The encounter with Tamiris was not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of philosophies, the settled, organized world of the empire meeting the wild, untamable spirit of the wilderness. In the heat of the final battle, amidst the dust and the thunder of galloping hooves, the thread of Cyrus's life was finally cut. The details of his passing vary. Some say he fell in the thick of the fray, while others tell more mythic tales of his end. But the essence of the moment remains the same. The architect of the greatest empire the world had ever seen had reached his final horizon. As the news of his death travelled back across the mountains and through the gates of 100 cities, a profound silence must have fallen over the land. The man who had liberated the captive, who had rebuilt the temples of foreign gods, and who had governed with a hand of silk rather than a fist of iron, was no longer there to steady the scales of justice. This moment of departure invites a gentle meditation on the nature of mortality and the fleeting shadow of power. Even for a king who styled himself the king of the four corners of the world, the end is a solitary path into the quiet dark. Yet, as the centuries began to layer themselves over his memory like falling leaves, it became clear that Cyrus had achieved something far more enduring than mere conquest. He had planted an idea, the radical notion that an empire could be held together by respect and pluralism rather than through terror and erasure. This legacy began to drift through the halls of history, whispering to the leaders who would follow in his footsteps long after the Persian fires had dimmed. Centuries later, a young Alexander the Great would stand before the tomb of Cyrus in Pasargadae, hushed into a rare state of reverence by the simple dignity of the structure. Alexander, who had spent his life chasing the ghost of Achilles, found in Cyrus a different kind of hero, one who was as much a philosopher as he was a general. It is said that Alexander ordered the tomb to be restored and protected, recognizing that he was standing in the presence of a spirit that had defined the very concept of greatness. The influence of Cyrus traveled even further through the written word, specifically through the Cyropedia, a semi-fictional biography written by the Greek soldier and scholar Xenophon. This text became a manual for leadership, a quiet companion to the thinkers of the Enlightenment who sought to build new worlds upon the foundations of reason and tolerance. As the sun of the 18th century rose over the young woods of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson sat in his library, leafing through his own well-worn copies of the Cyropedia. To the men who drafted the American Constitution, Cyrus was not a distant myth, but a practical example of how to govern a diverse people while protecting their fundamental right to practice their own faiths and follow their own customs. The Edict of Restoration, carved into a clay cylinder in Babylon over 2,000 years prior, echoed in the halls of Philadelphia, proving that the kindness of a king in the ancient East could become the bedrock of a republic in the modern West. It is a comforting thought as we drift towards sleep to realize that no act of compassion is ever truly lost, that the ripples of a single life can cross oceans and millennia to touch the shores of our own time. And so, we return at last to the high, lonely plains of Pasargadae, where the ruins of Cyrus's capital stand as silent sentinels under the vast Iranian sky. The city that was once a lush paradise of flowing water and exotic trees has returned to the embrace of the desert, leaving only the white limestone bones of palaces and gates. The wind whistles through the empty doorways, carrying the scent of dry earth and ancient stone, yet there is no sadness in this desolation. Instead, there is a profound sense of peace, a feeling that the land has reclaimed its own, and that the king is finally at rest in the heart of the country he loved so dearly. The tomb itself remains, a simple stepped pyramid of golden-tinged stone standing solitary against the horizon. It lacks the towering arrogance of the pyramids of Egypt or the ornate carvings of the later Persian kings at Naqsh-e-Rostam. It is a house of quietude, reflecting the man who once asked that his body be returned to the earth without gold or silver, so that he might mingle with the soil that sustains all living things. There is a deep, rhythmic beauty in this cycle. The king who built an empire of stone and law, returning to the dust, while his vision of a more merciful world continues to float through the collective memory of humanity like a soft, persistent melody. As the stars begin to sharpen in the indigo vault above the desert, the silence of Pasargadae becomes a blanket, heavy and warm. The shadows stretch long across the plains, blurring the edges of the broken columns until the past and the present merge into a single timeless moment. We can almost hear the faint rustle of the wind in the long-gone gardens, the phantom sound of water trickling through stone channels, and the distant, rhythmic breathing of a world that is finally, safely, at rest. The legacy of Cyrus is not found in the borders of a map or the rubble of a wall, but in the quiet spaces between us, in the moments when we choose understanding over conflict and dignity over pride. The great king sleeps, and the desert keeps its watch. The fires of the camps have long since gone out, and the hoofbeats of the cavalry have faded into the sighing of the breeze. There is nothing left to do but let the weight of the centuries pull us down into a deep and dreamless slumber, guided by the memory of a man who looked at the vast, chaotic tapestry of the world and saw the possibility of a shared peace. The air is cool now. The light has faded to the softest charcoal, and the story of the architect of empire has reached its final gentle cadence. Sleep comes like the desert night, vast, silent, and infinitely kind, drifting over the ruins of the old world and the foundations of the new, until all that remains is the stillness of the stars and the enduring dream of a world made whole.